Hey everyone, my name's Andrew J. Clark. I'm a commercial and landscape photographer from Western Australia, and this video is all about the best landscape settings for Sony Alpha cameras. Now, most of this information is going to be generally transferable between the different manufacturers, but in this video we're going to be using Sony terminology and looking through Sony menus to get ourselves set up. I also know what the average viewer's attention span is like, so I've split this video up into 3 distinct parts. If you've got the attention span of a goldfish, watch part 1, where I will cover the key settings, but with only brief explanations. In the second part, I'll take you on location and show you through my sort of mental checklist for landscape shoots, as in the settings which you'll most often need to double check or monitor on location. Part 3 will be a deep dive into basically every setting and function that is relevant for Sony Alpha landscape photographers. Alright, goldfish viewers, you can skip to this timestamp now. For everyone else, just a quick disclaimer. This video isn't going to be covering exposure settings and how to manage exposure. So if you want to learn more about ISO, shutter speed, and aperture and what they do to your landscape images, I'll be covering that topic in the next video in this series. So look out for that one coming out soon. And before we jump into the settings, I just want to say a big thank you to everyone who watched and commented on my last video, which was talking about the A7S III and how good it is as a landscape camera. To get to 10,000 views on like my 5th YouTube video is absolutely insane. And that response just means so much and is so encouraging for myself and for this channel. I am new on this platform and growth is kind of hard on YouTube with so many amazing creators, particularly in the photography space. So if you do enjoy this video, my channel generally, or you learn something, please consider subscribing. You can always unsubscribe later when my channel goes to shit. Okay, onto the settings. I'm going to try and power through these as quickly as possible, but just note that the menus we're going to be looking at are from the A7 III and onwards. If you have an earlier model, most of the names of the options in the menus are going to be the same, but their placement in the menus or in the tabs may be slightly different. All right, first setting. In file format, we're going to change that to RAW or RAW and JPEG. RAW gives you the best image quality and most importantly for landscape photography, gives you the widest dynamic range. If you want to shoot in JPEG for the faster workflow, shoot in RAW and JPEG. That way you always have the option of referring back to the higher quality file later if you like. But if you do want to shoot in JPEG, make sure you get familiar with the creative styles in the menu and all of the JPEG options, because that can really help you get better results. Then RAW file type, we want to turn that to uncompressed. Sony's compressed RAW is technically a lossy format, which means you lose a little bit of data by shooting in compressed. If you're concerned about storage on your computer and you use Adobe Lightroom, consider converting to Adobe's RAW format, which is DNG, on import into Lightroom. Unlike Sony's RAW format, Adobe's is a lossless version of compressed RAW, so that will save you some file size without losing any quality. I'm not going to run through the other JPEG options right now. Remember, this is the goldfish section of the video. We're only going to be covering the absolute most important landscape settings. Okay, the next key setting, long exposure noise reduction. Now I'm going to have a full episode on long exposure photography on Sony Alpha cameras and this setting, long exposure noise reduction. But for right now, for today's purposes, turn that off. If you never ever shoot long exposures, as in a shutter speed longer than 10 seconds, you could consider leaving that on. But if you go on the occasional astro shoot and you take a 10-minute long exposure, you're going to wish you had that turned off. We'll come back to memory recall at the end of this section just to save our settings. Next key setting is focus mode. We're going to turn that to single shot autofocus, and we're going to change our focus area to a medium-sized flexible spot. Once we get to the exposure tab, let's put our ISO, set that to ISO 100. Again, that gives you the best image quality and the most dynamic range. So that's where we want to be as landscape photographers. Okay, the next important page is our color white balance image processing page. In a more general sense, these settings only really apply to JPEGs and don't affect the RAW file, but they do affect how your histogram displays exposure. I've done a video on this, which I'll link either up here or down in the description below. But for the purposes of this video, just set everything to either off or to neutral. So DRO, Auto HDR, we turn that off. Our creative styles we set to off, and our picture profile we set to off as well. This gives us a really flat looking, uninteresting JPEG, but it makes our histogram more reliable and consistent. And I recommend if you're a RAW shooter, you never turn these settings back on or mess with these settings in between shoots, because you want your histogram to be consistent between every conditions so you learn to rely on it. Again, this only applies to RAW still shooting. For JPEG shooters and for video, you will need to adjust these settings. We've already set up our autofocus settings, But some landscape photographers, in fact a lot of landscape photographers, prefer to manually focus their shots, and the focus assist menu has a couple of really important settings. Again, I've covered this in my focus quick tip video, which is linked in the description, but for this video, just know that I'm going to assign focus magnifier to a custom button on my camera because that's my preferred way of manual focusing. But if you want to use MF assist, which punches in every time you touch the focus ring, that option is in this menu now, and you can turn that on or off depending on your preference. I'll also touch on focus peaking in part 3 of this video. Next relevant page is our shutter steady shot page. Silent shooting typically doesn't have an impact on landscape photography, so if you need to turn that on for your conditions, feel free to do so. Steady shot is a setting that we need to turn off if we're shooting on a tripod. If you're shooting handheld, however, you want to keep it on. I'll talk about that a little bit more in part 2 on location. All right, I use grid lines all the time on my landscape shoots to help me compose my photographs. I wish we had more options in our menus for what type of grid lines to use, but pick one of rule of thirds or square grid, whatever you think you're going to use most, and we'll have that as our default. But I also put it into my function menu to swap back and forth while on location. All right, that's most of the settings which we need to toggle off and on. Now I'm just going to customize a couple of keys and the function menu before we save it into the memory inside the camera for quick recall later. Okay, first custom button I'm going to recommend is saving the focus magnifier option onto one of the buttons. On the A7C, I'm going to replace the AF on button with the focus magnifier, but on the full A7 cameras, I typically have it on C1. In the function menu, I'm just going to make sure I have grid lines and steady shot available because I'm often tweaking those on location. If you're a RAW and JPEG shooter, there's a good chance you'll want your creative styles and your picture profiles in the function menu as well. Let's set our shoot mode to manual so we have full control over ISO, aperture, shutter speed. Speaking of the exposure settings, let's double check that our ISO is at ISO 100, set our aperture to f8, that's a good starting point for landscape photography, and our shutter speed to 1/100. Again, just starting points. This should give you a reasonable exposure in a landscape context around sunset before we put filters on. So good place to start, but you'll always end up adjusting these through the course of your landscape shoot. Final thing we're going to turn on is just cycle through the display options until your histogram is showing. If editor Andrew comes up with some other really important settings to put in, you can chuck those up here now. Thanks, Andrew. Let's go back to the shoot mode menu, scroll down to MR or memory recall, depending on your camera, and let's save that to slot number 1 or whichever slot is available for you. All right, now with that saved into memory, all we need to do is twist this mode dial to the number 1, press the center button, and that will recall the entire camera state, all of the custom buttons, all of the exposure settings in a fraction of a second. So if you end up messing around with your settings or doing a video shoot and then you end up on location and you hadn't reset your camera, now you'll just be able to twist it to that dial and you're good to go. If you want to take a look at how I manage these settings on location, hang around for part 2. If you just want to keep grinding through Sony menus, you can go straight to part 3. Okay, so we've come down to South Perth to put some of these settings into action and to sort of take you through the key settings which I manage on location when I'm on a landscape photography shoot. I'm here with my buddy Mike. There he is. We're actually heading into summer in Perth, which is typically a really bad time for landscape photography. We get really blue skies and clear weather for most of summer. So when we spotted some nice looking high clouds rolling in earlier today, I was like, sounds like a good time to shoot down to South Perth and try and get some shots. The perspective which we're shooting right now for a long time was kind of undershot. It was a little bit of a secret within the sort of photography community, but recently I'm seeing more and more photographers come down here and take advantage of the kind of unique looking perspective of the city. Some of the best clouds have kind of rolled away, but we are getting some color on the city, so let's get to it. So the two main shooting modes for landscape photography are full manual and aperture priority. Typically I stay in full manual because it gives me full control over everything. From there you have full control over your ISO, aperture and shutter speed. So I map ISO to the scroll wheel on the back. That way I have ISO, shutter speed and aperture all on control dials on the camera. From there, I'm regularly cycling through the display modes to bring up things like the histogram or the leveling tool. I also recommend that you put a few things into your function menu. Definitely steady shot, because you want to turn that off when you're on a tripod. And I find grid lines to be very, very helpful. I use both the rule of thirds and the square grid lines quite a lot when composing my landscape images. Once you've got your exposure settings looking pretty good, there are a few different options on how to focus your landscape images. I've actually done a video on this already, but basically how I do it is I put my camera into single shot autofocus, and I have a small or medium sized flexible spot that I move around onto my critical focus point. I'll discuss in a later video how you figure out what that critical focus point will be, but it has a lot to do with your depth of field and the aperture that you want to shoot at. Once the camera's acquired focus on your critical focus point, you can then come around to the side of the camera and actually turn the lens to manual focus. That's one option. Or assuming that you've got your focus mode assigned to a custom button on the back of the camera, you can change it to manual focus here. That way your focus won't be reacquired every time you take a shot. At this point, my location audio lost the battle with the hundreds of birds that had swarmed the location. But essentially what I'm doing here is just double checking that I've got the long exposure noise reduction setting turned off. I've got that saved in my My menu, but it's also available in the first menu of the camera. Leaving it turned on doubles the length of time that you're locked out of your camera while doing long exposure photography, and that can be incredibly inconvenient during the critical moments of a colourful sunset. I then just enabled a 2-second timer in my drive mode because I didn't have enough hands to use my Bluetooth remote, and this is the image that I got. Alright, I'm just about to pack up. All the colours pretty much gone now. My buddy Mike's left me. But I thought this was a pretty cool shoot to share with you guys, because this is like pretty typical. This is kind of how it looks most of the time when we go out on our landscape shoots. I'd kind of identified earlier on in the day that there were some potentially good conditions, potentially a really nice sunset. So you just rush out and you go take the shot. You get to the closest good location to you and you roll the dice. I think if we'd been on the coast, like far out to the west, we would have been able to take much more advantage of the, purple magenta hues that we were seeing over there. But that's one of the things I really like about landscape photography. If you could 100% predict where all the good conditions were going to be all the time, I think you'd lose some of the fun and some of the sense of adventure and some of the satisfaction you get when you are in the right place at the right time. So it really is a numbers game. Just get out and shoot as much as you can, and you'll eventually end up in the right spot and get the stunning conditions. I'm not sure if future Andrew has overdubbed some images that I've taken here previously, but I've shot this location a few times before. And this was actually the first location I shot after COVID restrictions kind of lifted in Perth, and I got this phenomenal, stunning sunset here. I will chuck up that photo so you can have a look. So yeah, if you're in Perth, come here, check it out. It's a really good spot. If you're not in Perth, just get out and shoot as much as you can. All right, back to the studio for the wrap up. Okay, now let's run through the rest of the menus, and I'll talk you through some of the things which are relevant to landscape photographers, and we'll also take a deeper look at our customization options. All right, the color space option is a little bit of a trap. It doesn't matter for RAW shooters, generally speaking, but it does change your histograms ever so slightly. So for the most accurate histograms, keep it in Adobe RGB. For JPEG shooters, it's not as straightforward. If you're just an amateur and a hobbyist and that's why you're shooting in JPEG, keep the setting on sRGB. Unless you are an absolute pro and have a fully color managed setup from start to finish, you will not see any benefit from using Adobe RGB. And in fact, in some circumstances, it can really screw with your colors. Okay, a few useful settings in your shoot mode, drive mode menu page. Firstly, drive mode. You want to be in single shooting, self-timer, or one of the bracketing options if you know how to bracket. You don't want to select continuous shooting because that can actually grey out some other menu options which you might want to use for landscape photography. One which immediately springs to mind is the bulb mode for super long exposures. If you don't have a remote control, you're going to want to use the self timer to avoid camera shake, and you've got 3 options: 2 seconds, 5 seconds, 10 seconds. In the bracket settings, I recommend you change the bracket order to -0+. That way, when you import your photos into Lightroom, you have them in exposure order. The default order of 0-+ doesn't make a lot of sense to me, but if you like it, you do you. Now, if you're serious about time-lapse photography, the interval shoot function menu contains a lot of really good options. I actually saved this whole area into my menu for quick access, and I'd recommend you do the same if you're really into time-lapse photography. I'm not going to do a super deep dive into time-lapse photography settings right now, but just as a default starting place, let's turn our shooting start time to 2 seconds, so that's essentially like a 2-second timer. Shooting interval, let's just make it 1 second, so there's only a 1 second pause between shots. Let's change our number of shots to 999. Generally, I just let my time lapse run until I want to stop it, as opposed to running for a set period of time. Our exposure tracking sensitivity, I'm just going to put that to mid as a starting point. I'm going to put the silent shooting in interval option to off. Unless I've got a good reason to use the fully electronic shutter, I'm going to use the mechanical shutter. Shoot interval priority is an important setting, but it's only relevant when you've got substantial exposure changes in your time lapse. It's probably a setting for another video. Okay, the next setting to talk about inside the autofocus settings is the focus frame color. I like to set mine to red. I find that the other colors often get lost into the scenery, and even the white frame color can get lost in clouds or into water in some conditions. Red stands out the most, so that's what I like to have on by default. Sometimes the red frame can get really obnoxious, and if that's the case, if you select a wide focus area, the frame disappears, and then I would use manual focus. I'm actually going to jump way ahead in the menus right now because it logically makes sense to talk about this now. If we go all the way into our custom operation settings, we can change function of touch operation away from touch tracking to touch focus. So for landscape photographers, if you just want to find your critical focus point in the image, you can touch to focus on cameras which have the touch screen. If you leave it on touch tracking, it's going to be using Sony's real-time tracking system, and although that's really, really good for fast-moving subjects, it has almost no application in landscape photography. So for landscape shooting, I would turn that to touch focus. We spoke a little bit about the color white balanced image processing menu in part 1 of this video. Just to add one final point to that discussion, I recently discovered that your picture profiles can actually have a minor impact on your RAW files while shooting stills. I don't pretend to understand why this occurs, and I don't think that it's a significant difference, but just to be safe, make sure that your picture profiles are off when you're shooting RAW stills. And it also makes your monitoring and your histogram more reliable to read anyway. Okay, a quick discussion on focus peaking. I generally actually have focus peaking off for landscape photography, and the reason is I'm most often shooting wide angles with really, really deep depth of field, and focus peaking just ends up triggering throughout the entire frame and doesn't actually provide me much assistance and ends up cluttering the image a little bit. The times when I do want to use focus peaking are actually when I have a shallow depth of field, so maybe some more abstract landscape photography. In that case, I'll often have it set to peaking level mid or peaking level high and peaking color red, because in those challenging situations, I really, really want to see the peaking. But yeah, as I said, general landscape shooting, I actually have peaking turned off. I've seen some landscape photographers recommend using zebras to help manage your exposure in landscape photography. And I understand the rationale behind that recommendation for those who really understand zebras and exposure at a deep level. But I think for most amateur or even serious hobbyist landscape photographers, don't worry about zebras and just get really comfortable with using the histogram, because the histogram gives you information about exposure across the whole exposure range, whereas zebras will only trigger at one particular exposure value, and it depends on your settings. So often I find when I have used zebras in the past, I'll turn them on for one particular scene, for one particular application, and then I'll forget to turn them off, and I'll find them very, very annoying to then go into the menus and turn them off later. For the sake of completeness though, if you do want to explore using zebras for your raw stills photography, go into the zebra settings, turn on display, and then set up a custom C1 zebra level with the settings lower limit and 109 plus. This will ensure that the zebras will only trigger when your raw file is likely to overexpose. If you shoot on an older camera with less dynamic range, or you shoot JPEGs, you'll need to set that lower and you might have to experiment for yourself. But JPEG shooters will probably be around 100 plus for the lower limit to avoid those whites clipping. We're getting pretty into the weeds now, but find a frame rate. I set that to high for my landscape photography. I generally find as a landscape shooter, I'm not taking that many photographs on my shoot, so I'm not too worried about battery life, and I always carry a spare battery with me. If you find that you're running out of battery life on your shoots, turn it back to standard. Also set display quality to high for the best monitoring experience, again at the expense of worse battery life. Similarly, and jumping forward in the menus again, I like to set my monitor brightness to manual and +2 to give me a really nice bright monitor on the back of my screen. Again, landscape photographers were often outside shooting in the sun, just makes it easier to monitor on the back screen. And I also tend to prefer my viewfinder with a +2 brightness for the same reasons. If you find that's too bright, just turn it down. Do be aware that this does use more battery life, so if you're running out of battery on your shoot, turn them back to manual or to auto. Of course, if you find the screen's too bright, like you're doing an astro shoot, just turn them down again. I have seen some people get a bit thrown by having a brighter monitor and they end up underexposing their images because of that. Again, my recommendation would be to get really comfortable with the histogram, learn to read and rely on the histogram, because that information is transferable across screens and across platforms when you're editing as well. And there's no guesswork with histograms, so using them will remove those sorts of mistakes. A setting which has saved my butt on a number of occasions, release without card. This setting, when enabled, enables you to take a photograph without a memory card in there, and it will just display it on the back screen. Now, I can see a situation where that might be useful, but on the other hand, if you forget that you don't have a card in and you're shooting for minutes or potentially hours without having a card in, that situation would be disastrous. So I think the utility of having that enabled is far outweighed by the risk management of having it disabled. So turn that off and thank me later when it saves your shoot. Okay, last couple of settings before we jump back into customization. I think there's really no downside into writing your copyright information into the files in camera, and you can set that up in this menu. And finally, depending on if you're shooting with a camera with dual card slots or one card slots, you have the option to change your record media settings. If you want to shoot redundantly, you'll need to set that to simultaneous. If you don't have a need to shoot redundantly, make sure you turn on the option to automatically swap between media. That way, when one card runs out, it automatically swaps to the next card. Okay, a few things which I like to put into my My menu. I like to put in format memory cards into my My menu. Long exposure noise reduction, because I'm often turning that off and on. Interval settings, I put that in here as well. When I'm shooting on one of my cameras with dual card slots, I put in the record media settings into the My menu. And really anything else which we've discussed in this video can go in here if you think you're going to be changing it on a semi-regular basis. If editor Andrew thinks of some other ones, he'll chuck them up here. All right, that was a bit of a mission to record. I really wanted to be thorough and cover basically every settings in these cameras and how they relate to landscape photography. But of course, there are differences between the models, and I'm sure I missed something. So if you have any questions about the settings which I discussed today, or about some of the other settings I didn't talk about, please chuck your questions down in the comments below. I'm trying my best to respond to every single one of them. If you found this video entertaining or educational or just interesting, I'd appreciate a like on the video. And if you'd like to see some more videos from me, I'm doing plenty of stuff on landscape photography and also some more videos on the A7C and the A7S3. Please consider subscribing. You can always unsubscribe later, and it really helps me out to know that there are people out there who like this content. So yeah, thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.